The date is February 9, 1945, and Winston Churchill is sitting in the ballroom of Livadia Palace on the Crimean coast, staring across a polished oak table at Joseph Stalin, and the British Prime Minister is about to lose his temper in front of the world's press. They're discussing Poland, what will happen to the country that Britain went to war to defend, the nations whose freedom was supposed to be the whole point of this catastrophic conflict. And Stalin, puffing calmly on his pipe, is explaining with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow student that Poland will become a Soviet satellite state whether Churchill likes it or not. The Red Army occupies Warsaw. Soviet troops control every inch of Polish soil, and unless Churchill wants to start World War III immediately after finishing World War II, he'll accept reality and stop wasting everyone's time with romantic notions about Polish sovereignty. Churchill's face is turning red, his hands are trembling, and everyone in that room knows they're watching the exact moment when the wartime alliance dies and the Cold War begins. Churchill had arrived in Yalta 5 days earlier, on February 4, 1945, after a grueling journey that nearly killed him. He was 70 years old, exhausted from 5 years of leading Britain through existential crisis, and suffering from what his doctors politely called strain, but what everyone else recognized as the physical breakdown of a man who'd carried impossible weight for too long. The flight from Malta to the Crimea had been rough. The drive from the airfield to Livadia Palace had taken hours on roads damaged by war. And when Churchill finally reached his quarters, he discovered that the palace, once the summer residence of Russian czars, had been looted by German occupiers and hastily refurbished by Soviet workers who'd done their best but couldn't hide that this opulent building was now a shell of its former glory. Churchill's bedroom had damp walls, temperamental heating, and windows that didn't quite close. The bathroom plumbing made alarming sounds. It was hardly the setting for a conference that would determine the fate of Europe for the next half-century. But Roosevelt and Stalin were already there, and the Big Three Summit, the most important meeting of World War II, was beginning whether Churchill felt ready or not. The purpose of Yalta was straightforward in theory, but nightmarishly complex in practice. The Allies needed to coordinate the final assault on Nazi Germany, decide how to divide German territory after victory, establish the framework for post-war Europe, and create the United Nations to prevent future wars. Simple enough, except that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had fundamentally incompatible visions for what post-war Europe should look like. Churchill wanted to preserve British imperial power and prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt wanted American troops to come home as quickly as possible, while establishing a new world order based on international cooperation and American economic dominance. Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone of communist states between the Soviet Union and Germany, so that Russia would never again face invasion from the West. These goals couldn't all be satisfied simultaneously, and everyone at Yalta knew it. The question was who would compromise, who would fight for their position, and who would walk away with what they wanted. Stalin held the strongest hand, and he knew it. The Red Army had bled and died to drive German forces back from Stalingrad, from Kursk, from Belarus and Ukraine and Poland. Soviet casualties in the war would eventually total 27 million, a number so large it defies comprehension, a loss that exceeded the combined casualties of Britain and America by an order of magnitude. Stalin had paid for Eastern Europe in Russian blood, and he wasn't about to hand those territories to Western-style democracies that would inevitably become staging grounds for future attacks on the Soviet Union. His troops occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. They were 50 miles from Berlin. The Western Allies were still fighting in the Ardennes, recovering from the surprise of Germany's winter offensive. The correlation of forces, to use Stalin's phrase, favored Moscow, and Stalin intended to convert military dominance into political control. Roosevelt arrived at Yalta as a dying man, though he concealed the extent of his illness from Churchill and Stalin. He'd lost 30 pounds since his fourth inauguration in January. His hands shook when he lit cigarettes. He tired easily, forgot details he'd have remembered effortlessly a year earlier, and occasionally drifted off during meetings while others were speaking. His doctors knew he had advanced cardiovascular disease and probably wouldn't survive another year. Roosevelt himself probably suspected the truth, though he never acknowledged it openly. But he was determined to create the United Nations, to establish a framework for permanent great power cooperation that would prevent a Third World War, and he believed, perhaps naively, perhaps desperately, that he could manage Stalin, that personal diplomacy and American economic leverage would convince the Soviet dictator to moderate his territorial ambitions and accept a genuinely cooperative post-war order. Roosevelt was willing to compromise with Stalin on Eastern Europe to secure Soviet participation in the United Nations and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Churchill watched this willingness with growing alarm and realized that Britain and America no longer had unified positions, that the Anglo-American partnership that had sustained the war effort was fracturing under the weight of divergent post-war interests. The Poland question dominated the conference from the first working session onward. It was the issue that made Churchill's blood boil, the problem that kept him up at night, the moral quandary that represented everything wrong with the emerging post-war order. Britain had gone to war in September 1939 specifically to defend Polish sovereignty after Germany invaded. British soldiers had fought and died in that cause for 5.5 years. Polish pilots had fought in the Battle of Britain. Polish troops had served with distinction in Italy and Western Europe. The Polish government in exile in London had maintained diplomatic relations with Britain throughout the war and expected British support for Polish independence. But now Stalin was demanding that Poland's eastern border be moved westward to the Curzon Line, which would give the Soviet Union substantial Polish territory, and that Poland's western border be extended into Germany as compensation. More importantly, Stalin insisted that the post-war Polish government be dominated by Polish communists loyal to Moscow, rather than the Polish Poles who'd fought alongside Britain. Churchill's face was turning red, his hands are trembling, and everyone in that room knows they're watching the exact moment when the wartime alliance dies and the Cold War begins.
Churchill fought this outcome with every rhetorical weapon he possessed. During the February 6 session, he delivered an impassioned speech, arguing that Britain had a moral obligation to defend Polish sovereignty, that the London Poles represented a legitimate Polish government, and that imposing a communist regime on Poland would betray everything the Allies claimed to be fighting for. He pointed out that the Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, explicitly promised that territorial changes would reflect the wishes of the peoples concerned, and that the Polish people clearly didn't wish to become a Soviet satellite. He reminded Roosevelt that millions of Polish Americans would be outraged if Roosevelt abandoned Poland to Stalin. He warned that Soviet domination of Poland would create instability in Eastern Europe and plant the seeds for future conflicts. Churchill spoke with passion and conviction, his voice rising as he described British sacrifices for Polish freedom, his hands gesturing emphatically as he demanded that Stalin respect Polish independence. And when he finished, Stalin calmly rebutted every point, explaining with the logic of a man stating obvious truths that the security of the Soviet Union required friendly governments in Eastern Europe, that the London Poles were hostile to the USSR, and that Poland's future government will be determined by Poles currently in Poland, meaning the communists who'd entered Warsaw with the Red Army, rather than by exiles who'd spent the war in comfortable London offices. Roosevelt sided with Stalin, or at least declined to support Churchill's position forcefully. The American president argued for a compromise. Poland's borders would shift westward as Stalin demanded, and the post-war government would include both London Poles and Communists with free elections to determine the final composition. Churchill recognized this as a fig leaf that would allow Stalin to install a communist government while maintaining the fiction of Polish democracy. But Roosevelt seemed satisfied that he'd negotiated a reasonable middle ground. Churchill felt betrayed. He'd expected Roosevelt to support British positions to present a unified Anglo-American front against Soviet territorial demands, and instead, the American president was treating Stalin as a reasonable partner whose security concerns deserved accommodation. The wartime alliance was revealing itself to be a marriage of convenience rather than a union of shared values, and Churchill was realizing, too late, that Britain's diminished power meant his opinions mattered less than Soviet military might and American economic dominance. The February 9th session, the moment when tensions over Poland reached their breaking point, began cordially enough. Stalin arrived precisely on time, dressed in his marshal's uniform with its gold epaulets and medals. Roosevelt wheeled himself to the conference table, looking pale but attempting joviality. Churchill entered last, smoking a cigar, his expression already showing the strain of battles he knew he was losing. The official agenda included discussions of German reparations, occupation zones, and United Nations voting procedures, but everyone knew Poland would dominate the conversation because it represented the fundamental question. Would post-war Europe be organized according to democratic principles or Soviet power realities? Stalin opened the discussion of Poland by presenting what he called a reasonable solution. The Lublin Poles, communists who'd established a provisional government with Soviet backing, would form the core of Poland's post-war government, with a few London Poles added to provide democratic window dressing. Elections would be held as soon as possible, though Stalin was vague about timing. The new Poland would be grateful to the Soviet Union for liberation from Nazi occupation and would naturally pursue foreign policies aligned with Soviet interests. This arrangement, Stalin argued, reflected the reality that the Red Army had liberated Poland and that Polish security required friendship with Moscow. He delivered this proposal calmly, almost boringly, as if describing administrative procedures rather than the subjugation of a nation. Churchill listened with mounting fury, his face reddening, his cigar clenched between his teeth. When Stalin finished, Churchill erupted. The exact words Churchill used that day remain disputed. Different participants remembered the exchange differently, and official transcripts sanitized the most inflammatory language, but the substance of his outburst is clear from all accounts. Churchill accused Stalin of breaking promises, of violating the Atlantic Charter, of betraying Allied principles for cynical power politics. He pointed out that Britain had sacrificed enormously for Polish freedom and wouldn't accept a Soviet puppet state as the outcome. He demanded genuine free elections with international observers, real inclusion of London Poles in government, and guarantees of Polish sovereignty. His voice rose as he spoke, and witnesses described him pounding the table, gesturing wildly, his legendary rhetorical gifts deployed at full force. For several minutes, Churchill dominated the room, delivering what one American observer called the most passionate speech I've ever heard from him, a defense of Polish independence that was really a defense of the entire principle that the war had been fought for liberation rather than the replacement of one tyranny with another. Stalin waited for Churchill to finish, then responded with devastating calm. He thanked Churchill for his passion, but pointed out that passion doesn't change facts. The Red Army occupies Poland. Soviet troops control every city, every railroad, every government building. The London Poles spent the war safely in England, while Poles in Poland suffered under Nazi occupation. Which group should govern Poland? Exiles who fled, or Poles who stayed and fought? Stalin posed this as a rhetorical question, but didn't wait for an answer. He continued, "The Soviet Union has lost tens of millions of citizens to German invasion, and Soviet security requires that never happen again, which means Poland must have a government friendly to Moscow. If Churchill disagrees, he's welcome to send British troops to enforce his preferred outcome. Stalin paused after this comment, letting its implications sink in. Everyone in the room understood the threat. If Britain wanted to determine Poland's future, Britain would have to go to war with the Soviet Union. And Britain, exhausted after 6 years of global conflict, couldn't possibly fight another war, certainly not against an alliance whose armies had done most of the fighting and dying to defeat Hitler. Roosevelt intervened, attempting to mediate. He proposed that the Yalta Agreement include language about free and unfettered elections in Poland, giving the appearance of democratic principles, while leaving implementation vague enough that Stalin could interpret it flexibly. Churchill objected that this was meaningless, that Stalin would manipulate any elections held under Soviet occupation. But Roosevelt was tired, ill, and focused on securing Soviet cooperation for the United Nations and the war against Japan. He viewed Churchill's concerns about Poland as British imperial anxiety rather than legitimate worries about Soviet expansionism. The American president believed that Stalin, offered partnership and respect, would moderate his behavior and accept a genuinely cooperative post-war order. Churchill thought Roosevelt was being dangerously naive, but he couldn't change the American position without British leverage that simply didn't exist anymore.
The final Yalta Agreement on Poland, announced on February 11th, satisfied no one, but represented what Roosevelt called the art of the possible. Poland's borders would shift westward, as Stalin demanded. The provisional government would be reorganized to include democratic leaders from Poland and abroad, though the Lublin Poles would form its core. Free elections would be held as soon as possible. The language was deliberately vague, allowing each signatory to interpret it according to their preferences. Stalin could read it as endorsement of Soviet-backed government with token opposition. Churchill could read it as commitment to genuine democracy. Roosevelt could present it as successful great power compromise. The ambiguity was intentional. Clear language would have prevented agreement, but it guaranteed future conflict because the fundamental question of who controlled Poland remained unresolved. Churchill returned to London in mid-February, knowing he'd lost the argument that mattered most. British newspapers celebrated Yalta as successful Allied cooperation, but Churchill privately told colleagues he feared they'd betrayed Poland and perhaps all of Eastern Europe. His March 1 speech to Parliament defending the Yalta agreements was notably unenthusiastic, and perceptive observers noted that Churchill seemed depressed rather than triumphant. He'd spent 6 years fighting Nazi tyranny, only to watch Stalin impose Soviet tyranny on nations Britain had pledged to defend. The moral clarity of defeating Hitler was giving way to the moral ambiguity of accepting Soviet domination as the price of peace. Churchill found this outcome personally painful and politically indefensible, but he lacked the power to change it. The promised Polish elections never materialized in any meaningful form. Stalin installed a communist government in Warsaw, arrested or executed non-communist Polish leaders, and established one-party rule that would last until 1989. The London Poles were marginalized, their government in exile ignored by Western powers that had moved on to other priorities. Churchill's predictions about Soviet behavior proved accurate, but accuracy didn't change outcomes. Britain protested Soviet actions in Poland, but took no concrete measures to challenge them. Roosevelt died in April 1945, never learning whether his faith in Stalin's cooperation would be vindicated or betrayed. Truman, his successor, took a harder line toward the Soviet Union, but still accepted the reality of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. The Cold War that emerged over the following years had its roots in the Yalta Compromises, in the moment when the Big Three agreed to language that meant completely different things to each of them. Churchill's relationship with Stalin, never warm, deteriorated completely after Yalta. During the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the next Big Three summit, Churchill and Stalin barely spoke except during official sessions. The cordiality that had characterized earlier meetings when Britain and Russia were united against Germany had evaporated. Stalin made clear he viewed Churchill as an imperialist defending obsolete British power, while Churchill regarded Stalin as a dictator whose territorial ambitions threatened European stability.
The personal relationship between the two leaders reflected the broader geopolitical reality. The wartime alliance had been a matter of necessity rather than affinity, and once Germany was defeated, the underlying conflicts of interest reasserted themselves with a vengeance. Historians continue debating whether Churchill could have achieved better outcomes at Yalta. Some argue he fought impossible battles, that Soviet military dominance in Eastern Europe made Stalin's position unassailable, and that Roosevelt's compromises reflected realistic assessment of American leverage. Others contend that firmer Anglo-American resistance at Yalta might have constrained Stalin's ambitions, that the Western Allies conceded too much too easily, and that Churchill's instincts about Soviet intentions deserved more support from Roosevelt. What's undeniable is that Churchill himself believed he'd failed, that the Poland outcome haunted him for the remainder of his life, and that Yalta represented for him a moment when moral principles clashed with power realities, and principles lost decisively. The Poland dispute at Yalta also revealed the extent to which Britain's relative power had declined during the war. Churchill arrived at Yalta assuming Britain would play an equal role with America and Russia in determining post-war arrangements. He left understanding that Britain was now the junior partner in the Anglo-American relationship, that American preferences would dominate Western Allied positions, and that British objections would be noted but not necessarily accommodated. This was a bitter realization for a man who'd led Britain through its finest hour, who'd rallied democratic resistance when it seemed hopeless, who'd personified British determination during the darkest days of 1940 and 1941. Churchill had saved Britain from Nazi conquest, but saving Britain had required alliance with powers, America and Russia, that would inevitably supersede British influence in the post-war world. Yalta marked the moment when this reality became undeniable. The moral dimension of the Poland question troubled Churchill deeply because it challenged the narrative he had constructed about what the war meant. Churchill had framed the conflict as a battle between civilization and barbarism, between freedom and tyranny, between decent nations defending principles and aggressive dictatorships pursuing conquest. The alliance with Stalin had always been problematic for this narrative. The Soviet Union itself was a brutal dictatorship that had invaded Finland and Poland and the Baltic states, but Churchill had rationalized it as necessary pragmatism in service of defeating the greater evil of Nazism. But what happened when defeating one tyranny required empowering another? What happened when defending freedom required abandoning millions to unfreedom? These questions didn't have satisfying answers, and Churchill knew it. Yalta forced him to confront the gap between the war's proclaimed purposes and its actual outcomes, and he found the confrontation profoundly disillusioning.
The aftermath of Yalta demonstrated that Churchill's fears about Soviet intentions were well-founded. Between February 1945 and early 1948, Stalin systematically converted Eastern European countries into communist satellites. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia all saw communist takeovers, sometimes through manipulated elections, sometimes through outright coups. Non-communist politicians were arrested, exiled, or executed. Opposition parties were banned. Soviet advisors and military personnel ensured that national governments followed Moscow's directives. The free elections promised at Yalta occurred only in forms that guaranteed communist victory. The political independence Churchill had fought for simply didn't materialize, and the Western Allies proved unwilling to confront Stalin militarily over what Roosevelt had called Soviet spheres of influence. Churchill's March 1946 Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, represented his public acknowledgement that the post-war order emerging in Europe wasn't what the Allies had fought for, and that Soviet expansion needed to be contained rather than accommodated. The phrase Iron Curtain captured the reality that Europe was dividing into two hostile blocs, that the wartime alliance had completely dissolved, and that a new conflict, ideological, political, and potentially military, was beginning. The speech was controversial at the time. Many Americans and British still hoped for continued great power cooperation, but history vindicated Churchill's assessment. The Cold War that dominated global politics for the next 45 years had its origins in the compromises made at Yalta, in the moment when the Big Three agreed to disagree about Poland's future, and hoped that ambiguous language would paper over fundamental conflicts of interest and principle.
Looking back at Yalta from the perspective of 80 years, what's striking is how completely Churchill's worst predictions came true. Poland remained under communist rule until 1989. The Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet Union and didn't regain independence until 1991. Eastern Europe became a Soviet sphere of influence, its peoples denied the self-determination promised in the Atlantic Charter. The European order established at Yalta endured until the Soviet Union collapsed, proving far more durable than Churchill imagined possible and far more oppressive than Roosevelt hoped would occur. The conference that was supposed to establish framework for peace instead established framework for Cold War, and the compromises that seemed prudent in February 1945 looked like tragic mistakes when measured against the suffering they enabled. Churchill's performance at Yalta, his passionate defense of Polish independence, his warnings about Soviet intentions, his refusal to accept that power politics should supersede moral principles, represents both his finest qualities and his ultimate limitations as a statesman. He was right about Stalin, right about Soviet ambitions, right that the Yalta compromises would lead to exactly the outcomes he predicted. But being right didn't change outcomes, because Britain lacked the power to enforce its preferences, and America lacked the will to support Churchill's position at the potential cost of post-war cooperation with Stalin. Churchill could argue, warn, and protest, but he couldn't compel Roosevelt to adopt a harder line towards Soviet territorial demands, and without American support, British objections were just words. The personal dynamic between Churchill and Stalin at Yalta also reflected their fundamentally different worldviews and governing philosophies. Churchill, for all his imperialism and his complex views on democracy, believed in certain inviolable principles: national sovereignty, representative government, the rule of law, and the idea that military victory didn't justify imposing totalitarian rule on conquered populations. Stalin believed in power, in the right of the strong to dictate to the weak, and in the necessity of creating Soviet-friendly buffer states to prevent future invasions of Russia. These worldviews were incompatible, and no amount of diplomatic language could reconcile them. The Yalta Agreement on Poland papered over this incompatibility, but the paper was transparent and everyone could see the fundamental disagreement beneath it. Roosevelt's rule at Yalta remains controversial. His defenders argue he secured the best possible outcome given Soviet military dominance, that he successfully balanced competing Allied interests, and that his focus on creating the United Nations represented wise prioritization of long-term institutional cooperation over short-term territorial disputes. His critics argue he was too trusting of Stalin, too dismissive of Churchill's warnings, too willing to sacrifice Eastern European freedom for the illusion of great power harmony, and too influenced by American desire to bring troops home quickly regardless of European consequences. The truth probably combines elements of both assessments. Roosevelt was trying to manage an impossibly complex situation while seriously ill, dealing with a British ally whose power was declining and a Soviet ally whose military achievements demanded respect, and hoping that personal diplomacy could create cooperative relationships that would outlast immediate post-war tensions. The photographs from Yalta, the big three seated together, smiling for cameras, present an image of Allied unity that was already fiction by the time the pictures were developed. Churchill looks exhausted in these images, his face drawn, his eyes revealing strain that forced smiles can't conceal. Roosevelt looks ill, his face gaunt, his body clearly failing, though he attempts to project vigor. Stalin looks satisfied, almost smug, the expression of a man who knows he's won the important battles and is willing to make cosmetic concessions to maintain appearances. These photographs became iconic images of Allied victory, but they actually document the moment when the wartime alliance died and the post-war competition began. Churchill's daughter, Mary, who accompanied her father to Yalta, later described the conference as the moment when her father's wartime certainty gave way to post-war doubt. During the war, Churchill had been absolutely convinced of Britain's rightness, of the justice of the Allied cause, of the necessity of total victory over Nazi Germany. After Yalta, he understood that victory had costs and consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. that defeating Germany required empowering the Soviet Union, and that the post-war world would be shaped by powers, American and Soviet, that Britain couldn't control. This realization aged him visibly, Mary recalled. He'd fought so long and so hard to save Britain and defeat Hitler, only to discover that saving Britain had required accepting Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and American primacy in Western Europe. It was a victory, certainly, but a victory more ambiguous and troubling than the clear-cut triumph Churchill had imagined during the dark days of 1940. The Yalta Conference ultimately demonstrates the limits of diplomacy when fundamental interests and values conflict. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all wanted to defeat Germany. But beyond that shared goal, their visions for post-war Europe were incompatible. No amount of diplomatic skill or personal rapport could reconcile Soviet desire for security through domination with Western commitment to democratic self-determination. The Yalta Agreement succeeded in creating language all three leaders could accept, but that language meant completely different things to each of them, and the ambiguity that enabled agreement guaranteed future conflict. Within months of Yalta, the wartime alliance was effectively dead, replaced by the Cold War competition that would dominate international relations for nearly half a century. For Churchill personally, Yalta represented a kind of defeat that military victory couldn't compensate for. He devoted 6 years to defeating totalitarian tyranny, mobilized every ounce of British strength and will, forged the alliance that eventually crushed Nazi Germany, and positioned Britain as one of the big three determining post-war order. But at Yalta, he discovered that Britain was really the junior partner, that American preferences and Soviet military might would determine outcomes, and that the principles he had fought for, national sovereignty, democratic government, resistance to totalitarian expansion, were being sacrificed for pragmatic power arrangements that offended everything he had claimed the war was about. He left Yalta having won the war but lost the peace, having defeated Hitler but enabled Stalin, having saved Britain but presided over the final erosion of British great power status. It was a bitter outcome for a man who had saved Western civilization. And Churchill carried that bitterness for the rest of his life, a reminder that even the greatest statesman can't escape the consequences of forces larger than individual will or national power.